Hi folks, Adam B. Levine here. Today's show isn't afraid to jump in the mud. First we sit in as Manu Sporny of the World Wide Web Consortium shares his perspective from years of battle for consensus in the trenches of web standards. He wants to bring the next 2 billion users into Bitcoin, and his methods are proven to work. The second half of today's show consists of a long interview I conducted with Jeffrey Paul, aka Sneak. Jeffrey is an American hacker and entrepreneur who splits his time between New York and Berlin. We caught up with him the day after the Inside Bitcoins event in Manhattan for an eye-opening discussion of cryptocurrency, security, privacy, the Onion Router network, and much more. I learned a whole lot from this interview and the talk before it, and I think you will too. If you have comments, questions, or topics for the show, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com/reddit to be directed to our new listener interaction subreddit. We've had a lot of activity here so far, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say. If you enjoy the content from the conference that'll be releasing over the next few weeks, please donate Bitcoins or Litecoins at letstalkbitcoin.com. This trip was out of pocket, and your support allows us to cover future conferences in the same fashion. We have 3 or 4 more scheduled before the end of the year. Also, thanks to Media Bistro for putting on such a great event with Inside Bitcoins. Once again, I hand it off to Media Bistro's Stuart. Enjoy the show.
So our next speaker I'm really excited about. We run another event called Semantic Web, semtech. It talks about big data, linked data, whatever you want to call it. He is one of the masters of the universe in that domain, and I was fortunate enough to meet him through our conference chair who runs our Semantic Web event. Manu Sporny is the founder and CEO of Digital Bazaar. He spends most of his time creating open standards and open technology that will integrate payments into the core of the web. His vision is to democratize finance. That's a big mission. You're going to help do it today, right? He's the chairman also for the Web Payments Standardization Group at the W3C. Let's give him a big round of applause.
So this is my first Bitcoin conference. I didn't really know what to expect. Part of me was kind of expecting like the lights to be a little dimmer than they are now, people to be kind of hanging out in the corners. So my experience so far has been complete opposite of that. It's been really cool to meet a number of the faces in the audience today and just talk about the future of Bitcoin. There's a lot of excitement around this technology here, and so because of that, I'm really excited to kind of talk to you about hopefully onboarding the next 2 billion Bitcoin owners, right? So I think all of us want to see Bitcoin grow to be much larger than it is today. And so part of what I do in World Standards is to figure out how to take kind of nascent technologies and build them into larger companies' products. People like Microsoft, Google, Facebook. We have a very successful track record of doing that, and so we want to kind of do the same thing for Bitcoin. So let's go ahead and get started talking about how we're going to get the next 2 billion people onto Bitcoin. So it helps to kind of understand where we're coming from as far as Bitcoin's concerned. And one of the easiest kind of metrics to look at right now is to see how big the ecosystem is right now. So the Bitcoin market cap right now is at around 1.1 billion US dollars. That's actually really surprising to me. I thought it hadn't grown that much over the past couple of years, but considering there was nothing, it was worth basically nothing a few years ago, that's pretty impressive. If you compare it to something like the US dollar money supply, this is M1, M0, M1, M2, basically printed currency, money that's sitting in people's checking accounts, money that's sitting in CDs. The US dollar supply is at around $16.3 trillion, right? So there's a huge gap there. The same thing with Bitcoin addresses. There are about 1.6 million active Bitcoin addresses today. If we just look at US bank accounts as a means of stored value, that's kind of the watermark of where people kind of store their money. In the US right now, there's 78.9 million accounts. Again, 50 times larger. So market cap, 16,000 times of a growth between Bitcoin and US dollar needed to get as big as US dollar, about 50 times for addresses. Now, I'm pointing this out not to say that this is a bad thing. This is actually fantastic news. It's really fantastic news for the people sitting in this audience, because you're getting in on the ground floor. We all believe Bitcoin's going to be absolutely huge, and I think all of us want to figure out the way to get it there. We want to figure out a way to grow it as quickly as possible in the most responsible way possible. So bottom line, Bitcoin has a lot of room to grow. So it's really exciting to be in this area at this time. Now, when you talk about growing a technology, and the World Wide Web Consortium has a lot of experience doing things at a world scale, right? The web, you started off as this tiny little project, and now it's this huge thing. So the questions that we want to ask, how are we going to get 2 billion people onto Bitcoin, need to be a little more pointed, right? How do we do this in the next 5 years? Because by putting a time limit on it, we time box it, and by time boxing it, we start reaching for low-hanging fruit, right? We start being a little more creative with the solutions for getting Bitcoin adopted in a much larger way. The other question to ask is, what ecosystem currently has 2 billion people that are fairly accessible to the Bitcoin community, right? So is it the cell phone providers around the world? There are many billions of people that have cell phones around the world. Is it the banks? Is it something completely new, a new protocol for the internet? And I think really the answer's pretty obvious, right? There's only one network on the planet that is 2 billion strong. There's only one network in the world that has a fairly even playing field, and that's the web. Right? 2.4 billion people access the web on a regular basis now. And if we're talking about asking the right questions, right? How do you get Bitcoin technology in front of 2.4 billion people? Well, it turns out that 97% of those people use one of 4 web browsers. One of 4 companies. So basically, those browsers are Internet Explorer, Safari, Apple Safari, Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox. If you can convince those companies to integrate Bitcoin into the browser, there will be an explosion in usage. And the good news is that one of those companies is actually very, very interested in integrating it in there. We'll get to that a bit more. But basically, the question is like, okay, fine. The web's out there. There are these 4 web browser companies out there. How do we build Bitcoin into the browser? What's the path forward? And that's kind of what I do, right? So I'm the chair of something called the Web Payments Group at the World Wide Web Consortium. My job is to go out there, find technologies that we can integrate with Mozilla Firefox, Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, and talk with those communities to figure out how we can get those technologies in there in a safe, interoperable way. I also do a lot of stuff with linked data and identity and security on the web. These are also really hot topics. Mostly it's because people want payments integrated into the web, but there are a lot of really complicated problems. These are problems that people have been working on for 10 years. They're not new things. Everyone knows they need to be fixed, but getting agreement between all of these companies is a difficult thing. I'm also the founder of a company called Digital Bazaar. We basically take standardized technology and we commercialize it. So we build software systems for banks and financial industry and folks like that. But I spent most of my time championing technologies that do things like the Web Commerce API, which allows you to do one-click payments through the web. Secure messaging. Whenever you're dealing with financial transactions, you have to make sure that the messaging is secure, but since the web is this open platform, there's a completely new set of problems that are kind of brought to the fore. HTTP signatures, which is a way of doing digital signatures in HTTP. A new payment protocol called Payswarm. Figuring out how we can do crowdfunding is a problem we're really interested in trying to put into the core of the web's architecture. Linked data technologies. And at the very end, we're really interested in Bitcoin and trying to figure out a way to help the Bitcoin community kind of build it in some of the more mainstream technologies that people use on an everyday basis. So For those of you that don't know who the World Wide Web Consortium is, it's usually referred to as the W3C. It was created by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who's the guy that invented the web. He still is the chair of that organization. It's based out of MIT. There are 392 member companies. So these are companies like Apple, Facebook, PayPal, Amazon, Boeing, HP, all the really big technology companies come to the W3C to figure out what the next architecture of the web is going to be. There are around 50 working groups active at any given time, working on things like HTML5, CSS, web payments, every single browser API that you use. If any of you have a web browser open right now, every single one of those web browser APIs was standardized at the W3C. So basically what I'm trying to say is the W3C builds the web. If you want something to reach 2 billion people, you work with the W3C, you convince the browser manufacturers that it's something that's worth doing, and you get it built in to the core of the web. Now, the process that you go through at the W3C to do this it's a pretty simple process. So you come up with a proposal. So let's say our proposal is we want to build Bitcoin into the browser. Right? That seems like something that's in all of our interest. You come up with a draft specification, which is basically a technical overview of how exactly that's going to work. Usually software developers work on that bit of it. And then if the membership, Microsoft, Apple, Google, agree that putting Bitcoin in the browsers is something that's worth doing, we create a working group. And that working group operates for 3 years, making sure that the standard is built properly, there are no security issues, there's an enormous amount of review. It's completely open, so the W3C is completely open to the public. All the meetings are transparent, so you get a lot of public comments from cryptographers and researchers saying fix this or fix that, or I see security issues here. Because of that, it takes roughly 4 years to create a standard, but once you have a W3C standard, you have the backing of the browser manufacturers, you have the backing of large companies like Microsoft, and that adds an enormous amount of legitimacy to your technology. The other really important thing, and I don't think many people know this about the web, but all web technology that is built into the browser is available under an open, patent, and royalty-free license, which means anybody can implement it, anybody can operate it. The reason the web is as big as it is today is because we have taken that path from day one on the web. Any kind of standards around web payments would follow the same path, and it's incredibly compatible with the way Bitcoin's built. Right, so that's one of the great things about Bitcoin. This talk is titled "One Web Under Bitcoin," and I think these two approaches for creating payment technologies are incredibly compatible with one another. So let's jump back for a bit and try and understand why the Web Payments Group exists at all at the W3C. W3C actually tried to solve the payment problem in 1999. We did a whole bunch of stuff with micropayments. It was a dismal failure. Because at that time, there wasn't a lot of interest in next generation payments. People thought credit cards were fine. Giving credit card numbers over HTTP unsecured was fine. So that folded. But fast forward 10 years, and we've got some really cool stuff happening with Bitcoin and Ven and Ripple and these cryptocurrencies. There's a lot of interest from the banking world to kind of update their architectures as well. But fundamentally, even today, exchanging funds on the web is way more complicated than it needs to be. We all know that there are problems here, right? The speed of old money, it can take days to get a payment from point A to point B. Computers can communicate in milliseconds, halfway around the world. There's no reason that money needs to be that slow anymore. Credit card numbers are effectively passwords into your bank account, and it seems kind of crazy when you think about it, but you're giving that password away to every single merchant that you do business with. They have unlimited access to your funds. Now, granted, there are a lot of legal I guess, protections in place to take them to jail if they misuse it, but it still does not stop those credit card numbers from being a really great target for people that want to steal your money. 1 in every 50 international transactions are fraudulent. 1 in every 180 domestic credit card transactions are fraudulent. That is a problem. It's a huge problem. It's such a big problem that there's a huge compliance industry that's built up around protecting those credit card numbers, but we all know that while it helps, it's not a really good solution to the problem. There are way too many steps required to send and receive money. Bitcoin has really made fantastic strides in this area, but even Bitcoin has its problems, right? Waiting for blockchain verification, losing your wallet keys. There are a number of places that Bitcoin could advance. I know a number of the speakers today are talking about those problems. The other things with other problems with payments, doing digital receipts, there's no machine readable receipt format right now. People email you receipts all the time, but what do you do with them? You probably hit delete or send it straight to the trash because it's pretty useless to you. What we'd like to do is make those kinds of receipts useful over a lifetime. Ideally, and this is looking 10 years out, we want people to be able to file their taxes by just pointing it at a transaction record. A personal transaction record, it's private, but it's got machine readable data and it can basically do your taxes based on the machine readable data in those digital receipts that you have. So, paths forward. What are the ways that we could build Bitcoin into the browser and get it accessible to 2.4 billion people? There are 2 paths right now that we're currently working on. The first one is called Payswarm. It's a currency-agnostic standard for web payments. Just like sending an email has a protocol on the web, just like Bitcoin has a protocol on the web, we want to be able to have this standard for doing payments on the web that's currency-agnostic. The Web Commerce API is something that Mozilla is working on, and we're helping them kind of build that into the browser as well. It's a standard for doing one-click payments on a website. You shouldn't have to go to a website and sign up for an account and verify your address and put in your credit card number. You should just be able to go to the website and click buy or donate or crowdfund, right? That's what we're going for here. So something really quick on Payswarm. Like I said, it's the first universal open standard for payments on the web. I do realize that Bitcoin is open. Bitcoin's open in a different way. It kind of leads with source. If you want to get something into the browsers, you have to lead with standards. That's effectively the way it's typically worked. It's payment provider agnostic. You should not care who your merchant's bank is when you go to pay for something on the web, and they shouldn't care who your bank is. The money should just flow to where it needs to go, and that's at the core of Payswarm. It's also currency agnostic. It doesn't matter if you're using US dollar, euro, Bitcoin, Ripple, Ven, alternative currencies, fiat currencies, they should all just work. Payswarm also has a number of really cool features, such as budgets. You can set up budgets with sites like the New York Times, so that as you go and read stories from day to day, you're charged a la carte automatically. You don't even see a buy button. Granted, you have to set that up prior to using the New York Times. Digital contracts and receipts, machine-readable digital contracts and receipts, that's also a big part of the standard. It has to be decentralized. The web is decentralized. No centralization. Centralization is bad. That is the way technologies are built at the W3C, because that is the thing that keeps the market, it gives the market an even playing field and allows companies such as those sitting in the audience today the ability to create really groundbreaking new technologies. The other thing that we care about a lot in the Web Payments Group is commercialization. This is not just a bunch of academics theorizing about what the ideal world would look like. We're involved with the messy details of the world. We want these technologies commercialized as soon as possible, so there's a huge focus on commercialization. Payswarm is currently commercialized in a system called Meritora. It works, it exchanges US dollars today. In about 6 or 9 months, we hope to have Bitcoin support in there as well. The other approach, so that's the open protocol approach. That's the, if we want to figure out out a way to really get Bitcoin in there, we do something with Payswarm. The other approach is something called the Web Commerce API. It's a way to initiate payments in the browser. We want to make payments easy and native. You should be able to just do a one-click payment for Bitcoin on a web page. You should be able to do a one-click payment for US dollars or euros on a web page. We're working with Mozilla Firefox. Their install base is around 400 million, 450 million people use Mozilla Firefox. So this API is going to be accessible to a very large number of people. Typically Google Chrome, Apple Safari, and Microsoft end up implementing in that order after the first version of an API goes out. The Web Commerce API is a dumb pipe. So if there are companies in this room that don't necessarily want to give up their proprietary API, their proprietary way of doing payments. While it's not ideal on the web, this provides a way for you to still do payments, one-click payments through the browser using your proprietary exchanges API. So once again, this is commercialized in Firefox OS, which is shipping very soon now. And it's going into the main browser within the next year. So there are multiple avenues forward to get Bitcoin into the browser, to get Bitcoin in front of 2.4 billion people, but we really need help from people in this community. If we don't get help from people in this community, it's going to take a much longer time to get it in there than it should. So we need people that are developers, executives, evangelizers. Basically, if you have any interest in putting Bitcoin in front of 2.4 billion people, certainly join the Web Payments group at the W3C. Pull me aside at the conference if you want to talk a bit more about it. Even if you're interested in kind of keeping up with what's going on, join the mailing list because we have a lot of people talking about a ton of different payment technologies and how it's going to work on the web. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions on the W3C, how it operates, anything to do with Firefox or how you get those people in there, please raise your hand to ask questions. So while we're doing that, these slides are on the web. If you go to payswarm.com/slides, all of these orange links that you see will actually go to source material. You can join the Web Payments group here by following the link on the slides. We have about 150 people in the group right now. We'd love to see a lot more Bitcoin folks in there. And then I talk about this stuff a lot on Twitter. Monosporny is my Twitter handle. I'm on Google Plus as well. If you want to send me a private email, there's my email address. Great. So in closing, right before we get to questions, if you're interested in this in any way, come and find me at the conference. I'm leaving at 4 p.m. today, but follow up via email. I'm very interested in talking with companies and getting Bitcoin into more people's hands.
Hi, Manu. I'm Jez. I'm an angel investor and tech entrepreneur. I had a question about one of your early slides where you said there were like 1.6 million Bitcoin addresses that had a value in them. Do you have any data on actually how many people that represents? Because obviously some people and some companies use lots of addresses. Yeah,
and that's one of the problems with that first slide is that it's not an apples to apples comparison. Usually checking accounts are shared by multiple people, whereas Bitcoin addresses are usually one person has multiple Bitcoin addresses.
And more importantly, merchants have disposable Bitcoin addresses, and so every transaction is a different address.
Yeah, so it could be that we're looking at only 100,000 people in the world use Bitcoin. But I think all of us in this room believe that there are more people than that using it. I mean, the cap is definitely about 1.6. And those are accounts that have money in them. Those aren't every Bitcoin address that exists. Those are specifically accounts that have money in them.
Awesome. Time for one more quick question? Yep, perfect. Here we go. I'm going to stretch over.
Hi, my name is Peter Seed, and Max Kaiser and I and myself are doing a startup called Trade4, the ultimate Bitcoin trading game. What about Facebook? I mean, when you were going through the numbers, I thought, well, if Facebook adopted a virtual currency, that would be game over. What's your thought on that?
So Facebook is also a W3C member. In fact, I know a lot of people. I know all the people at Facebook that are involved in standards. They're very quiet on it. All the big companies are very quiet on this, and they like to stay very quiet on it until there's more movement on the standard. It would be huge if Facebook had supported virtual currencies. I am almost positive, and this is completely unfounded, I'm almost positive that they're looking into it, just like every other large technology company is looking into it. But they're not going to be public about it. They're not going to say anything publicly until we get a web payments working group up off the ground and running officially, meaning that we need official approval from Facebook and Google to start a web payments group. We believe that's going to happen at the end of this year, in January. So if you get involved in the web payments group now, you will have a seat at the table to talk to folks like Facebook and Google about maybe getting an alt currency into there. I'd be happy to do any kind of connections between companies here and Facebook if you're interested in doing alt currency stuff with them.
Okay, great. I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there. Let's give Manu another big round of applause.
EasyDNS is the Swiss Army knife for your domain names, helping meet their customers' individual needs since 1998. EasyDNS has been an outspoken critic of SOPA and CISPA. EasyDNS was an early supporter of Bitcoin, and now they are proud to sponsor this show. Do business with a company that shares your values. Get a 13% discount when you pay with Bitcoin. Go to bitcoin.easydns.com and be sure to use discount code LTB.
Hi, this is Jason King for Bitcoin 100, and you're listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin. But you know, Bitcoin is not really a talker. It's a doer, just like the best nonprofits and charity organizations. And at bitcoin100.org, all we do is find hardworking nonprofits and charities and give them $1,000 in Bitcoin. That's all we do. So donate to Bitcoin 100 and let Bitcoin, nonprofits, and charities do what they do best.
Hi everybody, Adam B. Levine here with Let's Talk Bitcoin. Today I'm joined by Jeffrey Paul, aka Sneak. Jeffrey, we've been trying to get together to do this talk for, I guess, a couple months now. Mm-hmm. You have a really interesting background, and actually, it was your talk in Germany.
Mm-hmm. I started giving the talk in 2010. I think that one was from 2011 or 12.
You gave a talk called Financing the Revolution, mm-hmm. and that was actually the talk that turned me on to cryptocurrencies in general, and actually beyond even the cryptocurrency side of it, it explained in a way that made me understand why it was actually helpful to have currencies that weren't necessarily tied to identity and they couldn't necessarily be precluded for reasons that were arbitrary.
Yeah, one of the things I really like about the CCC, their events, they produce them. They're very technical, but they also produce them specifically with an eye toward freedom and liberties and things like that. Being German, they're very focused on personal privacy and the intersection between privacy and technology, and I like that. And so I didn't want to just give a purely technical talk. That, of course, has been done since then, but it was really important for me to show why it's not just some, libertarian gold bug thing that we need internet and electronic payments that can't be censored by government, but also it's just fundamentally important to everyone that believes in democracy or individual liberty within a society. Because without it, then there are a whole bunch of things in the dependency tree that stem from being able to make payments that maybe the government doesn't want you to. So that was one of the big reasons I wanted to give that talk. And I gave it sort of a provocative title, Financing the Revolution. At the time, Bitcoin wasn't really that big, and it's sort of now becoming this de facto internet currency, and we're going to see more and more of that, I think. Like, it's still not to the point where you could finance a revolution with it yet, but I think we'll see that within the next 5 to 10 years.
You're saying 5 to 10 years out. I'm curious, are you talking about Bitcoin specifically, or are you talking about cryptocurrencies broadly?
So, Bitcoin raises that interesting question. A lot of people, when they first hear about Bitcoin, they say, well, this is stupid, it has no value, and no one should use it. But the fact is, it does have value, because the subjective theory of value is really the only practical one. And you can argue all day long whether or not paper money has value or gold has any intrinsic value or anything like that. But the fact is that people accept them as value. And the same goes for Bitcoins. There are other cryptocurrencies that have sprung up, almost all of which are directly descended from Bitcoin. I think all of them are directly descended from Bitcoin, the decentralized ones anyway. But really it boils down to, are they useful? And I know a lot of people have gotten into Litecoin and Strongcoin and things like that, but honestly, I don't really care about these because the utility of a currency is only who accepts it. And when you're dealing with something this small, markets this small, and adoption curves that are linear, really the only thing that's interesting to me are the ones you can actually use as money today. And that's barely Bitcoin even. And Bitcoin is an order of magnitude larger than any of the other ones, at least.
Do you see that? So you think that advantage there is powerful enough that it will be Bitcoin for the foreseeable future because it's already achieved that, and so if one is going to put effort into something, it makes more sense to put it into that regardless of what else is out there?
Absolutely. I've never owned a Litecoin or a Strongcoin or any of that, and I think they're interesting research projects, but really this whole idea of a decentralized store of value, a decentralized payment mechanism is foreign to most people, and it requires a cultural shift for this to become accepted in the wider world. Right now it's of interest to security people, it's of interest to hackers, it's of interest to libertarians and other crypto anarchists, things like that. But the long-term thing here is that people need to understand that yes, this is an intangible, no, it's not run by a government, and yes, it has value. And that is a grassroots thing. I'm working on a new Bitcoin business, which I'll tell you about in a few weeks or a month once it's more solid. But one of the core metrics that we're tracking to illustrate the adoption of Bitcoin in the market is not how many Bitcoin transactions there are. It's not what the price of Bitcoin is on the exchange. It's how many nodes are on the peer-to-peer network advertising their address, how many people have actually downloaded and are running the software at this moment in time. And if you look at that curve, it's not an exponential curve. It's not these order of magnitude growth. And this is not a bad thing because it shouldn't be yet, but it shows strong linear growth. Every month, X thousand people hear about Bitcoin, download it, run it, try it out. And that adds to the pool, and then those people tell their friends. And I'm not saying it won't go exponential at some point, but so far we've seen linear growth, and that's a good thing. This market is still very, very small. A lot of people get really excited about how this is going to take over the world and all that, and it's true, but it hasn't yet. And because the market is so small, if all of a sudden you had thousands of people trying to buy $1 million worth of Bitcoin, the market would just implode. You can't even do that. And it's very difficult today to even buy a few $1 million worth of Bitcoin. So the metric that I'm using to monitor the growth and the expansion of this throughout society is not prices, is not transaction volume, but the network node count, which is not a lot of people seem to be charting, or there's a couple of people that are logging this data, and it's available to anyone. If you're on the network, you can see all of the addresses of all the participants, but this isn't really publicized a lot, and I think it's a very important metric.
Why is it important?
As I explained before, the value of a currency is its subjective value. And the more people that recognize Bitcoin as a thing and say, okay, this is software that I run and I use it and it talks to others, peer-to-peer software, the more people that understand, if not on a deep technical level, just on a cursory level, what Bitcoin is and how it works, then if nothing more than how the software works. You download it and run it and it synchronizes and you can send and receive payments. Those people are added to the pool of people who maybe not immediately, but may recognize Bitcoin as valuable. And that increases its utility.
So you're actually
the network effect.
So in this case, you're equating nodes to individual users.
Yes.
Okay, so when we talk about nodes then, there's a differentiation. There are full nodes, which actually have the entire blockchain, and then there are light nodes, which reference another service. Do you differentiate between those?
Well, you have to differentiate between those because light nodes, for example, if you just have a front-end client for an online wallet service, those aren't represented in the network. But there's no way for us without going directly to those services and asking. And some of them publish, for example, the blockchain.info wallet. They show how many people are using their wallet service. But, for example, I have no idea how many users the Mt. Gox has these days, or I have no idea how many users Coinbase has, or what their transaction volumes are. And it's very important for the long-term growth and the long-term value of Bitcoin to understand how many it doesn't have to be exact, but a rough order of magnitude estimate how many individual people recognize Bitcoin as valuable today, and how is that number changing over time? How many new Bitcoin users do we have per month? And like I said, it doesn't have to be anything even remotely exact, just we have to have some sort of feel for these numbers.
Right, right. So, one of the other things we've been talking about a lot is this idea that even though you have Bitcoin as this decentralized and cryptocurrencies as these decentralized networks, it seems like they are actually approaching more centralized infrastructures as mining becomes harder to achieve and more institutional.
Certainly. And I think that we're going to see in the short term a lot of this sort of centralization, but the thing that differs fundamentally between a decentralized model that tends toward centralization and a model that is centralized by its design is that if, for example, let's talk about the Federal Reserve wire network in this country. If you want to has a bunch of different participants. You can send wires between them, but if you want to participate with that, you have to go to the central authority and say, "I would," you apply to connect. Yes. Whereas with a decentralized service, even if it tends towards centralization, even if we only have 10 major players doing all the mining in Bitcoin, the fact is anyone can go out and go to someone who's manufacturing ASICs and buy a whole truckload of them, get an internet connection, get a rack, fill it up, and begin participating in this network. It's not a cabal.
Okay.
It seems like one because it's all early adopters right now. It's all people with entrenched interests. But that's going to change. We really haven't seen institutional money come to Bitcoin either on the investment side yet or on the hardware and tech side yet.
Although there are some rumors swirling over the last couple of days that institutional money is pouring into mining in a couple of different capacities.
Absolutely, it will be. There's going to be a lot of interest in all of the different ways you can make money using Bitcoin, leveraging existing capital.
Same sort of logic, it seems like, can be applied, that it's not necessarily bad to have a few ASIC manufacturers because they can be sold, because they're selling their product, and so it's still you get distribution. It's just about the manufacturing side.
A perfect analogy here is SMTP, email on the internet.
Okay.
We have massive centralization with email on the internet. Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, Facebook now. There are a dozen providers that handle over 90% of all of the email on the internet. This makes it very easy for the NSA to go to them.
Right, I was going to say,
However, anyone can set up their own email server and interoperate with these people.
Right.
That, in theory, could change in the future if these people decided to implement rules. For example, Google used to run Jabber servers that anyone could connect to. Could run your own Jabber server and have IM conversations with people on Google Talk, and then they shut it off. A lot of people are upset about that, but it's the exception, not the norm, to federate with things like that. With email, you have to. Everyone that gets email expects to be able to send and receive email to anyone with an email address.
Right, no walled
even
gardens.
if it's not, exactly. Even if it's not at Gmail, and maybe users are getting trained otherwise with the proliferation of direct messages on Facebook and Twitter and things like that. But I still think that people that have email addresses would, if you had a weird email domain and someone couldn't send email to you or couldn't receive email from you, I think users would have an issue with that.
Right. No, I totally agree. So, on the other side of the issue, there's the minor centralization concern on the ASIC side, but then we start talking about, what if you could go back to CPUs as the primary thing for mining, and you were able to create something that essentially didn't scale, mining technology that didn't scale. So,
well, it still scales. It just scales with CPUs. You
right,
just
exactly.
buy more CPUs.
Exactly, but
it's the same. It's the same cost curve. It's just you spend the money on something different. I mean, you can buy. Certainly, it doesn't scale. Maybe the orders of magnitude that it does.
Well,
you can still go out and buy.
Well, for example, yesterday at the conference, we spoke with several ASIC manufacturers, and they're in the transition point now. The 28 nanometer chips are just about to come out, and then they're moving to 14. I'm sorry, it's 20. It's a number it's not 14. 14 is coming out Q2 of next year. But the point is that each one of these is an exponential step up in terms of efficiency. And so for everyone who's purchased the equipment before, they're essentially invalidated. They no longer, the equipment doesn't generate enough return to even justify operating it under most of these circumstances. So we have been having this, ongoing conversation about what the point of mining is, and what I want to get to with you is one of the common things that we get is that if you were to revert to CPU mining, given the size of the Bitcoin network at this point, you would have botnets, large botnets that would dominate. But it seems like this competition element makes it so that you would have, the incentives are there to have multiple botnets essentially competing with each other, and it would be very hard to achieve dominance with any one particular network.
So fast forward to the end game of ASIC mining. Assume that we have the physical limit of ASIC efficiency. The thing you have to remember about the timeline we're on with Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is still very new. You can buy most of the publicly available Bitcoins right now for under $10 million. It's a very, very small market, and despite all the media attention, it's still not a very big market. It's growing very quickly, and in 5 years it will be gigantic, and it's already gigantic compared to where it was even a few years ago, but we're still in the early adopter phase. Despite all this,
right, I totally agree with you.
And so, before the early adopter phase is over, we will be at the end game of ASIC mining. And because the difficulty is variable, it doesn't really matter if we're at the end game of ASIC mining or at the end game of CPU mining. What it becomes then is a function of how many dollars can you spend on chips, because the ASICs and the CPU, it'll just compensate for however many you're running in the total of the network. And so what it boils down to is that the people that will control mining are the people who can dump the most money into chips, whether those chips are general purpose CPUs or whether they're ASICs or GPUs or whatever algorithm is the best available technology in the market for running that proof of work.
So talking about this end game, do you think that's a problem?
So whether it's a problem or not doesn't matter, because Bitcoin's decentralization requires a proof of work. And there's no proof of work that we can design that is resistant to someone who's willing to spend $50 million.
Okay.
Like you can just...
Because money is effectively work in this context.
Yeah, exactly, because you just buy more chips and buy more power.
Right.
And there's nothing that can stop that centralization. More resources equals more proof of work. It doesn't matter if it's an ASIC that does 500 billion more operations per second than a general purpose CPU. It's just a matter of how many dollars can you dump into your mining rig.
Right.
Because eventually ASICs will, we went from CPU miners to GPU miners. I ran one of the very first GPU miners. I was generating a few hundred Bitcoin a day at the time. I bought this is actually a really funny story. When I started mining, I bought a $500 ATI video card. I put about 10 of them in my Amazon cart. And the way I figured is I did the little mining calculation, and I was about to put them on my American Express card, and I have 30 days to pay for that. So I was like, well, if I get these and I put them on the computers, then I mine the Bitcoin, they'll pay for themselves in 2 weeks.
Right.
And then, so I put 10, and then I was like, you know what? Well, what if this whole Bitcoin thing is
right.
What if this? Then I just blew $5,000 on video cards. What am I doing? And so I took 9 of them out, and I just bought one, and I got it, and it generated a few hundred Bitcoin a day, which today seems ridiculous.
But at the time, what were they worth at the point that you were doing this?
It paid for a video card, I think in maybe 2 or 3 weeks or something.
So a $500 video card, 2 or 3 weeks, and a couple hundred coins a day.
Yeah.
So
and it was when the Momchill miner, the very first GPU miner that was publicly released, and I got it working, and it was cool, and But then I just sold the Bitcoins immediately as soon as they were generated, because I didn't know if I wasn't interested in speculating in the currency.
Right.
So I think what's going to happen, we go from CPU mining to GPU mining, from GPU to ASICs, different process sizes with ASICs. Eventually, we're going to bump up against limits, and at that point, the difficulty will be the same. For dollar for dollar for GPUs, or rather ASICs running this proof of work, or for general purpose computers running some different proof of work. Right. Certainly, it's like a Band-Aid, But the answer is, in as far as I see it, switching to a different proof of work, using a different cryptocurrency that uses a different proof of work. It's a huge dent in the adoption curve. Say, okay, don't use Bitcoin, use Strongcoin or something else like that. You're not going to get even double-digit percentages of people to stop using one and start using the other. And the benefit is not a long-term benefit, it's a short-term benefit, because eventually whichever one becomes dominant, and I think it will become dominant because we don't need more than one. I mean, one is enough. And I think that'll be Bitcoin. People will just dump all of their money into whatever chip makes them the most money, and it doesn't matter what algorithm that's running.
See, now I used to believe that too. I used to think that that there can only be one thing, because again, you've got the network effect, and that's such a powerful advantage in this particular type of field. Because like a language, money isn't that useful if nobody else uses it. But it seems like right now we're in almost a reality bubble where people look at the new situation that we have with cryptocurrencies and they say, okay, well, I use one because that's what you do. But it seems like there are some disruptive things coming in the future to the Bitcoin network and to the Bitcoin protocol potentially, that have the potential to pop that. And there are altcoins waiting at every, hungrily waiting to capitalize.
I'm not saying they're going to die. I'm just saying that there will only be one that has 50 million users.
Okay.
I don't see altcoins as providing enough utility versus the one that already has the network effect going for it. I mean, there will be lots of altcoins out there that have lots of use, but my theory is that Bitcoin, or maybe it might be an altcoin, but there's only going to be one that's going to have 50 or 100 or 500 million users 5-10 years from now.
So I know I said we talk about privacy. We'll get to that in the next segment. So have you read the Bitcoin 2 specification that's been floating around?
I have.
Very curious for your thoughts on that. Can you kind of summarize some of the things that it proposes?
So I really we're talking about the second Bitcoin white paper, not
yes.
So I like the ideas and I like the concept of not having to make substantial changes to the Bitcoin network protocol or the blockchain, because for exactly the same reason I mentioned before, the network effect. If you had to make substantial changes and you have some sort of you have to pick A or B, or if there's a fork, then you're not going to get buy-in. Right. Because the reason that Bitcoin has been so successful so far, and I think the core devs understand this on a fundamental level, is because it's a set of rules we've all agreed on de facto. If we start changing those rules, there's going to be some percentage that say, well, I didn't sign up for this.
Well, but that's the thing, of course, is that the Bitcoin 2 paper that came out wasn't released in a vacuum. It was released as a direct response, it seemed to me, to the changes that have been proposed for 0.9. Have you taken a look at that?
No, I haven't looked at those yet.
So my understanding is that 0.9 includes new additions, basically, that add a central issuing authority so that invoices can be issued, and then they can be verified again by a third party, and so that sets off all sorts of warning bells.
The thing with something like that is that as long as it isn't in the direct payment chain, like if there have been a lot of initiatives to figure out a way of authenticating a request for money.
Right.
Because all of the ways that we have for conveying keys from person A to person B are subject to the same key management problems we've been having with crypto and users for the last 20 years. So a method for someone to verify that this key that is requesting money from you is actually the key that you want to pay is not a bad thing. Whether or not it should be in the protocol is another question, or if it should be something that runs alongside it. But as long as it's not in the actual coin transfer path, I don't really see anyone having a huge problem with it.
Okay.
A central, maybe not a central issuing authority, but a central certification authority, which just sounds like what you're describing. A public key that ships with the client that says, this is a legitimate request.
Right.
Certainly, it gives a little bit of control where people might have an issue.
Well, it's that slippery slope thing. I mean, that's the problem here.
Certainly, but it doesn't necessarily. As long as there's a wall there in between the actual payment system and the an authentication system for certifying transactions. Because as long as you can always send a transaction to a key that you've verified yourself, as opposed to verified by some central group, then you should be fine. I don't see anyone really having a major problem with that.
Fair enough. So, but that is my understanding is that it's not necessarily that these are just ideas that, you know, these people, I believe the group is out of Panama that's released this specification, that, you know, like they just came up with ideas in a vacuum, that rather this was a response to things that are coming. So so with that in mind, it seems like the situation isn't that we keep going as we're growing, or we change and we do this new thing. It seems more like one way or the other we have to change.
I really don't think that's necessarily true. One of the things that some of my associates have nicknamed Sneak's Law is users cannot and will not securely manage key material.
Okay.
Most users can't, and the ones that can won't. And so what this means is that this is why we don't have this is why we still use passwords on the web. This is why we still have most email being unencrypted. This is why, users just can't securely manage key material. They can't be expected to, and then the ones that can just won't, because it's a huge pain in the ass. And so the nice thing about Bitcoin is that it sort of forces people's hand, in that if you're going to use Bitcoin in a non-centrally controlled fashion, like you're going to run your own Bitcoin software, then you have to manage your key pair, because your key pair are your Bitcoins. If you use something like an online wallet, then you're kind of just outsourcing that whole thing to someone else. But a lot of people, the thing that they like about Bitcoin is its decentralized nature, right now anyway. Maybe not 5 years from now, but most people, I think, like Bitcoin right now because it's decentralized. And so that forces people to mind their keys, because if they don't, then they can't participate, or they just get their Bitcoin stolen immediately. Right. And so what that can trigger is that we now have the basis for a web of trust, because a Bitcoin key can be used, as it was added to the client, I think in the last year or maybe year and a half, that you can sign an arbitrary string with a Bitcoin key. So these are just key pairs. You can use them to encrypt. You can use them to you can use them to sign. You can use them as,
and then you can verify it once it's signed.
So you can use these. You can use these keys for any sort of crypto operation, not just for Bitcoin. And I think that is the method by which you can sort of bootstrap this sort of thing. It doesn't need to be centralized, and can be built alongside Bitcoin without actually changing the client.
I see.
Something that reads your wallet and can issue a signed message saying this other Bitcoin key is ours, or something like that. Right. So you could recreate something like PGP's Web of Trust, which, to be fair, has been a huge usability failure. But with the correct sort of user interface and social protocol on top of it, so people are already used to Bitcoin's keys sort of being a huge pain to deal with. So if you're already doing that, then you might as well reap the benefits from that as well.
Right. Well, that makes sense. Well, I really appreciate you clearing up some of those things that, this is a, I try to come at this from as much of explaining it as possible, and this is still hard. I'm curious, with Sneak's Law, what, so it's just that it's a huge pain in the ass, basically.
Well, so most people don't know how.
Okay.
And the ones that know how don't, because it's inconvenient.
So do you?
I try. But, you and I both use OTR, for example, for instant messaging. How many of the OTR contacts that you speak to on a regular basis have you, not via SMS, not via some also possibly man-in-the-middle channel, have you verified their OTR fingerprints?
Right, it's a handful.
I click the verify later button more than I do anything else.
Yeah.
And I know, and I know how to manage keys. The fact is, it's secure communications, which is one of the primary reasons we want to use cryptography, are really, really hard. A buddy of mine pointed this out to me the other day. I was trying to write about how there's so much snake oil being released in the wake of all this NSA spying, and everyone wants to make some easy app that you can just download, point and click, and then it'll encrypt everything securely, and then the NSA is foiled. Well, unfortunately, secure communications are logically a hard problem, even in the most simple block diagram mode. Even if you have the most perfect user interface, you have to do key management somehow. And if you just magically wave your hands and say, oh, well, everything's secure and encrypted, and you don't address key management, you've not solved the problem. And so users need to understand that key management is fundamental to secure communications or effective use of cryptography.
Do you think that there is a solution for this problem?
There is. I think that it will be partially hardware and partially social. I think that eventually what's going to happen for us to use the tools that we believe to be government snooping resistant, people are going to have to learn to manage their key, or they just won't have privacy.
Right.
That's the other option. Or we can...
Either one of them solves the problem in a manner of speaking.
The technology now is getting to the point where it's going to be easier to manage key material. Bitcoin, like I said, Bitcoin is forcing the issue because there's been so much work in hardware modules and key storage and offline key generation and smart cards and all this kind of stuff, because people realize that if you store your keys on your computer and your computer gets hacked, your keys are gone.
Right.
And so there's a lot of people now interested in building things that will allow them to keep their keys private, even in the case of their computer getting compromised, which happens all of the time. And once you have that in place, those same keys can be used for any sort of crypto operations. Right. And that, I think, is going to be the seed that eventually forces people to adopt the web of trust. Because, like online payment systems, there's only two ways they can go. One way is that you have a phone that is basically, under the control of your national government, that accesses some centralized system for making payments, and you don't think about your keys because it's authentic. Like you go you show your government ID and they give you new ones or something like that. It's all centrally controlled. But that's not going to fly because more than ever, national governments don't trust each other.
Right.
This whole PRISM thing that's come out with the NSA spying on everyone, like they've basically put a bullet in the head of the U.S. internet industry because no one's going to trust U.S. companies with private data ever again. And we live in a global economy. So the payment system that's going to win is going to be one where everyone can stand there in the standoff with guns pointed at everyone else, not trusting anyone, because that's the market we live in. Whether you like anarchy or not, whether you're an anarcho-capitalist or not, that's the market that Earth has between nations. I kind of like that. That's one of the things that makes me sleep well at night, is that regardless of whatever laws man tries to implement on this planet, we still have an anarcho-capitalist society in between nations.
So let's talk about that for just a brief second here, and then I think we're going to end this segment. So when we talk about anarcho-capitalistic relationships on a nation-by-nation basis, I think a lot of people take that as being chaos, but that's not really the world that we live in. It's more like relationships where everybody acts in their own best interest to as great a degree as is feasible.
Well,
is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the reason that we have markets that aren't voluntary is because of coercion. And you can't coerce another nation state that also has nuclear weapons aimed at you. Like the way that we implement all of these systems of control within a nation is with the threat of force or the delivery of force if the threat doesn't work. And when you go to a nation state level, that doesn't work anymore. Because, like, for example, that's why Snowden went to China, is because the U.S. can't bully China around because they have all the weapons that we do. Right. And so what we're going to see eventually is that for payment systems, and it may just be national walled gardens. We may just go back to where it's much more difficult to trade with people in other countries than in your own. But I think that too many people now expect the internet to make global commerce easy. Right. And no amount of legislation, I think, is going to put that cat back in the bag. So the systems that succeed will be the ones that make that easier, not make that harder. And no one's going to use their enemy's centralized walled garden for payments. The way we do it right now is that we have settlement systems in between these countries, but
they're bulky.
They're bulky and they're slow and they're time consuming and they're heavily regulated. I think eventually it's going to start. It has started with the black market, but eventually it's going to force the above ground markets to get with the program, because you can't compete with something that working like that. You can't compete with something that can make a payment in 10 minutes of any size to anyone on Earth with an internet connection. Like, it's just not going to fly.
But with cryptocurrency, you can.
You can.
So, Jeffrey, one of the first things that you and I started talking about when you got here this morning was this idea that privacy is not only important, but that people really are misattributing what is actually happening right now in the world as far as privacy is concerned. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people came to Bitcoin because It allows them something that's censorship resistant. You can pay anyone you want, anywhere you want. The government has no say in it. But Bitcoin itself, as we know, is not anonymous. The flows can be easily monitored through the Bitcoin blockchain. But let's say that you've somehow managed to satisfy yourself that you have Bitcoins associated with a key that is sufficiently disassociated from yourself. You use a mixing service, or you bought them for cash to a brand new key, or some way that you came across Bitcoin and they're sufficiently disassociated from yourself. Now, a lot of people say, well, then now that you have these anonymous Bitcoins, you can use Tor and you can send them to whoever you want, or you can sign a transaction and use Tor and push it through some web interface that lets you publish transactions, and then you can use Bitcoin totally anonymously. And the problem, I think, with that is that there's so much in the Bitcoin ecosystem that people hang their hopes upon Tor right now, and we because not a lot of people understand how it works. They assume that it's this black box. You use it, and then you're anonymous on the internet. And the problem with that, I think, is now that we've learned that the NSA monitors all internet traffic, both overseas and domestically. They've tapped all the submarine cables, and they've tapped directly into exchanges for years now. It becomes very easy to, it doesn't matter what encryption Tor uses, just from traffic analysis, watching the flows of traffic through the network, it becomes very easy to, A, have a complete picture of the Tor network itself, and B, watch traffic as it enters, bounces around, and pops out. And a lot of people have said historically, well, all you have to do to subvert Tor is run a zillion Tor nodes and watch the traffic yourself. And that's well within the reach of the U.S. military. But they don't even need to do that now. They can just watch the traffic between people's existing Tor nodes. And statistically, it becomes very easy to correlate these flows because Tor provides relatively low latency. So if you put a message into Tor, and it goes between these nodes. So we view this in our head as just a graph of Tor nodes, but the reality is that all of those node-to-node connections run over cables that do not mirror that Tor graph. For example, let's say it goes between three nodes. It may bounce back and forth across the same cable 3 times,
right,
as those nodes talk to each other, because you have no idea where they are.
Right.
And if the NSA monitors all of that information, it becomes very easy for them to associate that, assuming that your connection goes on for more than 1 or 2 packets, which it has to. So, from my perspective, if you're trying to protect yourself, you protect your privacy on the internet from the government in America, then Tor is insufficient, which means that all of the other privacy guarantees that you're expecting Tor to provide to higher level protocols, for example Bitcoin, are also insufficient. So if you're doing something, for example financing a revolution with Bitcoin, let's say Bitcoin now has enough value to do that, and you use Tor to send these payments, or to receive, you receive the payment, use Tor to send it to someone else, you're going to run into a problem, because the Tor becomes transparent if you can monitor enough of the network.
Let's Talk Bitcoin is heard each week by thousands of people who are participating in the new digital economy. Our listener base of Bitcoin owners, miners, investors, technologists, and merchants is growing fast. We offer a limited number of short advertising slots in each show to keep our listeners engaged and to provide maximum impact for our sponsors. If you'd like to talk to us about Let's Talk Bitcoin, send us an email at sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
If I showed you a website where you could easily purchase electronics from the world's largest distributor with Bitcoins at 0% markup, would you think it was too good to be true? Good news, it's real, and it's at bitcoinstore.com. Choose from 500,000 items, save money over Amazon and Newegg, and convert your Bitcoins to real-world items. You can even buy with privacy. All they need is a shipping address. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself at bitcoinstore.com.
okay, let's back up and simplify this a small amount. So Tor is the onion routing network, basically. And
it's used for anonymity on the internet.
Used for anonymity on the internet, with the idea being that essentially every node can only see the ones that it directly connects to, and since it routes from node to node to node to node, you can't tell which node is originating because you can only see one step in either direction.
Yeah, and then they're encrypted in various layers.
Right.
So that way, as the layers peel off, then it comes out the other end.
Okay, but the problem that you're laying out here is in a culture and in a system like we have right now of pervasive surveillance, you can essentially put a ring around it and watch everything that goes into it and everything that comes out of it, and because of the low latency nature of the system, it's easy to correlate those so long as you have that top down 10,000 foot view.
You have to be able to monitor the connection, the traffic between every single node.
So is that also true? Again, going back to Bitcoin for a second.
Or the majority of the nodes.
Right, exactly, the majority of the nodes. Obviously, the more that you can see, the better your picture is, but it works even at like a 50%. I mean, I have to imagine at a low level it would still work too.
Yeah, one of the benefits of Tor is that it's used worldwide, and so a lot of nodes are outside of the United States. But there aren't a ton of Tor nodes in general, but more importantly, there aren't a ton of people using Tor.
Right.
And that's really the biggest problem, is because
it's self-selecting to a certain extent.
Not only is it self-selecting, but also you're not going to have a ton of traffic to hide in. One of the ways that this could be mitigated is with changes to the Tor software and protocol that send defined amounts of traffic at regular intervals.
I see.
Padding, and just send it whether you're actually sending something or not.
Right.
And this would make it...
So more noise.
Yeah, exactly. But this takes up a lot more bandwidth and makes the cost of running a Tor node higher and increases latency for everyone.
Right. So you reduce functionality in order to increase anonymity and the security.
But all that means is that fewer people are going to use it.
Right, exactly. And so it compounds the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
So again, going back to Bitcoin for a second here, everything that you just told me seems like it applies even more so to Bitcoin mixing services, because Bitcoin mixing services, you don't even need to stand on the ring around. Instead, you have the entire graph right there in front of you.
That's true.
So are mixing services worthwhile at this point?
Well, the thing with mixing services is that you can, with Tor, you're connecting from source A to endpoint B. And it goes through Tor, but it's a single point-to-point thing. Whereas with a mixing service, you can combine many inputs into a single key and then fan those out to different keys. And as long as you have sufficient inputs and sufficient outputs, certainly the mixing service knows what's going on.
Right.
But someone who just has the blockchain might not.
So this is different.
If you only have 5 inputs and 5 outputs, then obviously that's going to be easy to track. But if I feel that Bitcoin mixing services, if they have sufficient adoption and also sufficient trust, because they're going to have to be trusted, because the mixing service needs to know who put coins in to get coins back out.
Right.
Can work correctly, but they have to have a lot of users, and they have to be written in such a way as to not compromise the identities.
Right.
And they need to actually mix.
So the difference here is that in the Tor network, when you send data through, it is the same data that enters as that leaves functionally.
Well, the size, yes.
The size, yeah, okay. Whereas with a mixing service, it's like you put 5 in, and those 5 go to somebody else, and you get a different 5
The other thing
back.
is that this is traffic analysis, right? So with a Tor, when you send data through Tor, that data comes out the other end in less than a second.
Right. Okay.
When you send coins into a mixing service, that might, depending on the contract that you have with the mixing service, you might not get those back for maybe a week. It's much easier to hide networks from an enemy that is using traffic analysis if you can increase latency and increase chaff padding in that message. Whereas with something like Tor, which is designed to be as low latency as possible for usability, it becomes much, much harder.
So again, if people are seeking anonymity or seeking some sort of meaningful privacy through systems like this, are there other systems you would recommend that they use, or is there a way to use Tor that is safe?
That's the problem, is that I don't know of any other system on this scale that offers any of these guarantees. One of the biggest issues that we have right now is that there's no way that I know of to communicate securely on the internet without giving up your social graph. Even assuming Tor is broken, assuming you use strong cryptography and you do key management perfectly and all of your associates do key management perfectly, you're still sending data from point A to point B.
Right.
You can still analyze that traffic. And until we have large networks with many, many users that are sending regular fixed size blocks of data at regular predictable intervals so as to mask the actual frequency of messages that are real, or the size of those messages that are real, or the time, the time stamping of those, then we're not going to have anonymous communication on the internet. We can have private communication right now using strong cryptography, assuming key management is done right. That's a big if. But we're not going to have anonymous communications.
So does that matter?
Absolutely it matters. Traffic analysis alone, which is being referred to in the press today as metadata, is everything. Let's say you're trying to start a revolution and you have a cell with 5 people in it, and your cover gets blown, 3 or 4 of them get thrown in prison. They're going to know exactly where you're going to go. They don't need to know what the contents of that traffic is. They just need to know who your associate network is, and then they can target them directly. The concept of traffic analysis is an amazing thing. There's cryptanalysis and there's traffic analysis, and with no understanding whatsoever, with completely opaque messages. And usually they're not completely opaque, but assuming for a moment the messages are completely opaque, just knowing when they're sent, how frequently they're sent, and from where and to where, you can get a lot of information. And there's no way to hide that on the internet. That's how the internet works. And so the best way that you can do is you can obfuscate it. You can send fixed size messages at regular intervals, and then embed your irregular communications into those.
I see.
But that requires being plugged in all the time,
Right.
and you're still sending fixed size messages between people. You're going to need a very large network.
So, playing out this logic, what does the world look like in 5 years? What does the world look like in 10 years?
Oh, a lot more totalitarian, I think.
That doesn't sound tremendously good.
I mean,
is there, is there a good scenario that can come of this? Are there actions you think that could lead us there?
So I'd love to say that, if we just make the right software, we're going to win the war and give everyone anonymity and privacy. But it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, this is going to be a lot of little battles between people that want total control of payment systems and people that want total control of internet monitoring, and those that recognize that that's toxic to a free society.
So does that look like the SOPA PIPA of last year? I mean, is it something different than that? I'm trying to get an idea of what even these moves are going to look like moving forward.
A lot of it will be software, but a lot of it is just going to be individual cultural changes that we have to make in the ways that we communicate.
I see.
It's been an open secret for years that, this was in action spy movies years ago, burner cell phones that you send a text on and throw in the garbage because, the British or U.S. intelligence is going to zero in on you. Like, we know that the ways that we have of communicating are monitored. We've known this for years. Now we have direct evidence of it. And it extends to the internet as well. There's a slide deck that came out today illustrating a program that's been going on since at least 2008, where the NSA, this is separate from the PRISM one, where the NSA monitors the content of people's traffic and puts it all in a big database, and then makes it searchable by low-level NSA employees. Everything you do on the internet. And using
content, not metadata.
Yeah. And because here's the thing, collecting 100% of the metadata comparatively is very easy. And then collecting specific bits of content that you find interesting for everyone is also very easy. You don't get all the content. You receive all the content, but then you filter it and chop it up and save all the messages and all the information and the photos and things like that. You don't need to save every time the Facebook logo goes over the wire.
Right.
And so they put all this information in a database and then make it available to their analysts.
So we're in New York right now. You generally live in Germany, and you're an American citizen. And why do you do that? Why aren't you here?
One of the big reasons I left is because there aren't any good, large American cities. I like city life, and there.
You say that in New York?
Yeah, I love New York, but I'll never live here again.
Okay.
I lived here for years before I moved, and it's just America suffers from this terrible sense of we have to use a lot of government or we won't have nice things. And a lot of people buy into that. New York is very much like that. San Francisco is very much like that. I want to live in a world-class city. I don't want to pay out the nose to do it. And I'd like some semblance of freedom in my day-to-day life. And you don't get all those three things at once in any city in America. It's kind of a bummer because all the people I care about are here, and I'm authorized to work here.
Yeah.
I think one of the big issues that a lot of people don't realize about this whole NSA thing is that, especially given that Tor, this completely negates the usefulness of Tor,
right?
Is that when you have all this data, even just the metadata, but also they have all the rest of the data as well. You have all this data and you put it into a database, and let's say you're only using it for anti-terrorism activities today, which also we've learned it doesn't really work that. It doesn't work 100% well for.
Right.
What you're setting the stage for is a push-button silent military coup in this country. Because when you have a database like this, maybe it's not abused today or tomorrow or 5 years from today, but 10 years down the road, you have all this information about every single person in the country. Anyone that has access to that, that's sufficiently evil, and we don't know what the future is going to hold. We don't know who's going to have access to that database in the future. Anyone that has access to that can then blackmail anyone in the country.
Right.
You can blackmail every federal judge, every congressperson, every state governor.
It's a lot of power.
It's unlimited power. And the person that wields that can control the entire country, and by extension most of the free world, because America's sort of the last global superpower.
So let me ask, I mean, given where we are today, can this be walked back? I mean, clearly what's happening is extra constitutional. You know, I mean, we're both American citizens, and we have supposedly the right to a variety of things, to say what we want, and you know, there's supposed to be protection from searches and seizures, which certainly this sort of metadata and content collection seems to breach. I mean, do you think that the system can even walk this back should it want to, or are we just...
So let's say that they dismantle the whole thing and tell us they've done so. What's to stop them from building another and lying about that and copying the data over? I mean, the Director of National Intelligence has already lied directly to Congress, right? I don't think there's much hope for this country. I think the long-term solution is for people to realize that the only way to sustain this sort of thing is for them to continue eroding freedoms, because the more liberty you have, the less effective this thing is, and the more you can resist it. And so, we've seen currency transactions in this country go from 10,000 to 3,000 lower, and now, and suspicious activity reports are filed for any dollar amount now. Like, we're losing the ability bit by bit to conduct ourselves in ways that are not subject to surveillance. And I think eventually that's going to lead to a brain drain. Eventually, because as it stands right now, no foreign company that has high-value confidential data is going to trust it to any U.S. company. Every U.S. company is at a huge starting disadvantage on the internet right now, because it's public knowledge that they can be forced silently to spy for their national military. And so what this means is that people that want to not start with a disadvantage are going to start companies in other countries. And that's going to directly affect the tax base of the U.S. and the GDP and the quality of life here eventually. It's a long road, but the end of America is now beginning.
And with that, Jeffrey Paul, a.k.a. Sneak, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this portion of our special Let's Talk Bitcoin conference coverage. Big thanks to Media Bistro for putting on a wonderful event at Inside Bitcoins. Stay tuned for more to come over the course of August. If you have any questions or comments for me directly, you can email Adam at letstalkbitcoin.com.